Anime has come a long way as an art form, but with new shows being released so regularly and with so much variety, the sheer volume of content available means not every show is going to be a masterpiece. In fact, many anime series have glaring mistakes in their stories, characters, or presentation that can be frustrating to the point of ruining whatever you're watching. Today, we'll be taking a look at Tales of Byston Well, Garzey's Wing, as well as some of the common and more specific mistakes made, and how it could have been fixed to reach its potential. Tales of Byston Well, Garzey's Wing is a 3-episode OVA directed by the famous and influential Yoshiyuki Tomino, whose previous work included hits like Mobile Suit Gundam and Astro Boy. I'm a huge fan of both of these, so let's try and get to the bottom of what went wrong with Garzey's Wing. Released in 1996 to mixed reviews, Garzey's Wing tells the story of Christopher, who's failed his college entrance exams and decides to let off some steam by attending his class reunion. Unfortunately for him, his soul is stolen by a big goose. And I don't know if this is just a translation error, but he calls out to himself for help right off the bat. Like he has in 3 seconds already gone through the mental process of recognizing himself as a separate entity from Chris. Despite later being surprised by their connection, I don't know. Anyway, the big spirit goose throws his naked soul into a black hole. He passes by some interdimensional beings, snags a fairy on his necklace, and falls into the midst of a battle. He also has wings attached to his feet now. And all of this happens in the span of maybe 15 seconds. Short story short, Chris now finds himself isekai'd into the world of Byston Well, where he must use his newly acquired feet wings to free the slaves of the king's army. Now you may be saying, you didn't really describe anything that happens in the show. Yeah, nothing fucking happens in the show. Homeboy Chris and the slaves run from the king's men. He discovers he's the reincarnation of a god sent to help people. Then we learn real-world Chris is still alive and kicking, existing in tandem with Byston Well Chris. And then everybody walks for a really long time. It's basically the Oregon Trail, except the primary threat is royalty and monsters instead of dysentery. Eventually they fight some people, and Chris leaves back to his world, keeping the power of Garzey's Wing. So where did it all go wrong? Was this show doomed from the beginning to be terrible, or was it something specific that led to such negative reception? Let's untangle this mess. There's one thing that I feel is important to acknowledge and get out of the way first. The animation quality. Now, I'm not an animator by trade. The extent of my talents are making little keyframe animations in After Effects. So when I talk about the animation in Garzey's Wing, I want to be as equitable as possible. I understand there are a lot of things outside of the control of the animators and even directors and producers, like time constraints, issues with budgeting, outsourcing, or simply using tools from a time that's considered outdated by today's standards. I want to be clear that I actually didn't mind a lot of the animation in Garzey's Wing. I think a good portion of it, while maybe not the smoothest and most extensive, is absolutely serviceable. Even the bad animation, I often didn't mind because I felt the context it was presented in didn't need fine attention to detail. Unfortunately, there were a lot of circumstances where I couldn't excuse it. The good animations weren't just reserved for contextually appropriate settings, they would be thrown in seemingly at random on minute details that don't really contribute to how the audience perceives them, leaving you wondering if there's some significance you're missing out on, or if they're setting up for some payoff that will never exist. And on the flip side, the bad animations would often be used for really attention-oriented interactions and transitions. One example of this that immediately comes to mind is the use of horse riding. There would be a scene where Chris rears his horse, and it looks pretty decent despite not really carrying any weight or specific purpose. And then immediately cuts to the soldiers and Chris retreating on horseback, fearful of the war beasts chasing them, and they're just kind of bobbing up and down for like 3 seconds. If you're going to show me that you can make a nice horse animation, and you have to choose where you're going to use it due to constraints, why not use it in the areas where having visual stimulation actually lends to the audience's perception of the event? I can honestly excuse having a mix of good and bad animation, but choosing where the good and bad ones should go is so much more important. This anime struggles with this issue of where am I trying to draw your attention a lot, not just visually, but in terms of script, story, and pacing as well. I think this is as good a segue as any to acknowledge that Garzey's Wing isn't the first story set in the Byston Well world. Yoshiyuki Tomino also directed a series and movie with the title Are a Battler Dunbine, which was received much more positively. There was also a retelling called The Wings of Rien, which was generally scored somewhere between Aura Battler and Garzey's Wing. So it's clear Tomino had a fondness for Byston Well, not only creating multiple series within it, but even choosing to return to it after an installment that basically flopped. And I kinda get why. Byston Well is a pretty cool and original world when you pay attention to the concepts it presents you rather than the quality of the methods they're delivered through. I think this is a huge contributing factor to why the story of Garzey's Wing feels so disjointed and monotonous, because basically the entire OVA is in media res, or intentionally takes place in the middle of the overall plot structure rather than having a clearly defined Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 progression. It's like Star Wars, but if Episode 2 was the entire story.
Whatever happened?
Speaking of undeveloped characters, Chris is just an absolutely pathetic protagonist. When he first enters Byston Well, he just starts fucking swinging at anyone near him, not knowing the affiliations of any of these people he's for sure killing. Luckily, they are evil, so then Chris just kinda chills with the people he helped escape on their way to freedom. That's literally it as far as his development goes. Character development in general is just sort of put on the back burner, and its presence would really assist in actually attaching yourself to these characters. Most of the dialogue in the show is limited to characters directing other characters or providing some kind of immediately needed information that won't contribute ever again. There's so many opportunities to further real progression as arcs instead of having these hollow, dissonant talk boxes. Fantasy Chris talks with real Chris. That's a legitimately unique way of having an inner dialogue, but they never use it for this. You could literally take out all of the real-world Chris scenes and you would miss nothing. It's really a shame, because there are so many of these original ideas that are completely shut down due to the material they're shoehorned into. The War Beasts are sick. The two Chris dichotomy is a relatively fresh take on the isekai trope. They have a focus on this kind of archaic strategy combat that I like a lot, and so many of these little world-building details that either go unutilized or seem to just kind of show off, hey, isn't this a cool idea? What the fuck? Ew! Ew! And as far as morals or themes go, it's kind of hard to pick any out. I guess they have an everyman hero thing going on, like you can be ordinary and still do great things, but that's kind of dwarfed by the fact that Chris was literally blessed by a god to have flight-granting wings attached to his feet. Ultimately, Garzey's Wing is pretty disappointing, not just because of the poor quality, but because it could have been so much better, even with the limitations they were working with. Honestly though, I would still recommend watching it, because it's extremely short and genuinely fascinating to see the decisions that were made and try to piece together why. If you enjoyed this analysis on Byston Well Garzey's Wing, don't forget to subscribe, and let me know in the comments which bad anime you'd like to see me cover next.